Negotiators at UN's COP27 climate summit in Egypt have approved an historic deal on compensation for vulnerable nations. After days of gridlock, countries at the summit agreed to set up a loss and damage fund to help the nations most at risk of climate change disasters. Calls for such a fund have dominated the last 2 weeks of talks. The details of the deal still have to be negotiated, including which countries would foot the bill. Now, while the deal has won praise, many officials say it falls short on both loss and damage provisions and on commitment to reducing emissions. Here's what EU's climate policy chief Frans Timmermans had to say.
We are proud of our contribution to the creation of this fund that will serve the interest of those most in need of support. But I urge you to acknowledge, when you walk out of this room, that we have all fallen short in actions to avoid and minimize loss and damage. We should have done much more. Our citizens expect us to lead. That means far more rapidly reduce emissions.
DW climate reporter Ajit Niranjan joins me now. Ajit, so they've agreed on a deal where richer countries will pay poorer countries, will help them out to deal with the damage climate change has done. What does this mean in practical terms?
It means that rich countries are now forced to not only look at helping poorer countries adapt, so building higher sea walls and things like that, or clean up their energy grids and kind of helping them build renewable energy and wind turbines and solar panels and so on, but also that they're accepting some of the financial responsibility for extreme weather events that have been made worse by the fossil fuels we've burnt disproportionately in countries like Germany, in the US, in France and so on. And so this is a huge step forward because for 30 years or so, poorer countries have kind of been asking for this, and in all these climate talks, it's never been something that's even been on the agenda. This year, for the first time, it got put onto the discussion table, and after kind of huge 2 weeks of incredibly intense negotiations, countries like economies like the EU and the US, which had previously blocked all attempts at this, have relented to some degree and said they'll set up a fund.
So it's a big step forward, but there are those who say that this fund already falls short of what is needed.
Exactly. I mean, there's two ways you can look at it. The first is that rich countries definitely do not want to accept any liability for the damages done because they feel that if they, one of the big barriers to them setting up the fund in the first place was this feeling that if they agree to any type of financial responsibility, then they'll be left with a bill that will run into the trillions of dollars. The second aspect of this is that they've repeatedly failed to keep their promises. So in a climate summit in 2009 in Copenhagen, rich countries agreed to pay poor countries $100 billion a year by 2020. That money never materialized. It got to about 83 billion by 2020. And even now today, they're still trying to catch up and get to that 100 billion number. So I think there's a lot of skepticism from the poorest countries that the amount of money needed will be even put in this pot.
OK, so apart from the fund, what else is in the deal that's been agreed in Sharm el-Sheikh? And more importantly, what's not in the deal?
So there's a lot of technicalities in which there's been progress on all sorts of areas. But the key thing that's missing, really, from here is very clear statements about getting rid of fossil fuels. So the only line that the deal contains referring to them is saying getting rid of unabated coal power, which means coal power plants that haven't been fitted with technology to capture the carbon dioxide from them, and phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. There's no clear definition on what unabated actually means in this context, how good these carbon capture technologies need to be, and there's no clear definition on what inefficient means when you're subsidizing fossil fuel projects. What's really absent from this document that we saw this morning is words like oil and gas, which are fossil fuels that when you burn them, heat the planet. And we know from the science reports that this same declaration welcomed explicitly. They make it very clear we need to rapidly get rid of these fossil fuel sources. There's still room in the mix for a small amount by 2050, but then with the technologies to capture them in place, and definitely on a scale that's drastically lower than what we've got now.
Right, so a mixed result then in terms of climate policy in Egypt. Thank you very much, Ajit Niranjan, DW climate reporter.